The wind carried dust like a veil across the prairie that afternoon, soft as ash and sharp as glass. Clara stumbled through it, each step sinking heavy into the dirt road that wound toward the ranch house ahead. Her shawl, once the color of cream, was now dulled with the same earth she had been walking for days. Beneath it, her infant stirred, a fragile weight in her arms bundled in threadbare cloth. The child whimpered, and Clara pressed her cheek against the bundle as if to lend it strength, though her own strength frayed with each breath. The house rose from the horizon like something half-carved from the land itself. Its boards were gray and battered, weathered by storms and years of wind. A corral leaned into its own shadow. Tools rested where a man's hand had once left them. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. For Clara, it was not a house but a last chance. Her shoes had worn thin long before, and her stomach had known nothing but ache for days. She had tried to find help in town, but pity there came laced with suspicion and whispered shame. Men watched her too long, women turned away, and no hand offered more than a crust or two. Out here, beyond the town's edge, there was only one more door to try. When she reached the porch, she lifted her hand to knock, but found she had no strength left for ceremony. The wood beneath her knuckles was scarred, gouged by years of weather and use. She leaned against it instead, whispering a prayer that was more breath than word. The door opened before she knocked. Eli McKenna filled the frame, tall, broad at the shoulders, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm. The man seemed carved from the same timber as the house. His face was rough-hewn, his beard touched with gray, his eyes steady but unreadable. For a moment, silence weighed between them. The prairie wind hushed as if waiting. Clara's lips trembled. "Bread," she whispered. Her voice was cracked and faint. "I'll trade you the child." For bread. The baby stirred, a tiny hand slipping free of the shawl, fingers curled like a plea. Eli's gaze flicked to the child, then back to Clara. His silence was not hesitation but something deeper, carved into him like rings in a tree trunk. Behind him, the dark of the house yawned, smelling faintly of wood smoke and coffee long gone cold. Clara swayed where she stood. Her knees threatened to give. The humiliation of the words, offering her own flesh for food, burned her throat. But pride had long ago been stripped away by hunger. She expected laughter, or a curse, or the door to close. Instead, Eli said nothing at all. He stepped aside, leaving the threshold open. The pause was long enough for Clara to feel the weight of judgment in it, long enough for her to wonder if she was stepping into mercy or some new sentence. When she crossed, her legs buckled, but his hand was there, calloused, steady, catching her elbow before she fell. The baby whimpered louder, as though sensing the crossing of some invisible line. Inside, the house was dim. Shadows clung to the corners. A table sat near the window, its surface worn smooth by years of meals and labor. A rocking chair rested near the hearth, motionless as though waiting for a body long gone. The air smelled of pine kindling, dust, and silence. Eli closed the door against the wind. He did not light a lamp nor offer words. Instead, he went to a cupboard, pulled free a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and set it on the table. Clara's eyes stung at the sight of it. Her hands shook as she tore a piece and placed it to her lips. The taste of grain and salt was almost too much. Her throat closed around it, and tears slid down her face before she could stop them. She fed the child next, dipping a corner into water Eli had set down, softening it for the baby's mouth. The child latched greedily, and Clara bent over him, her shawl draping like a shield. She whispered soothing words, though her voice broke on each one. Eli leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching. His silence was not cruel. It was something else, something unspoken, as if words had long ago failed him. His eyes carried storms of their own, though Clara was too weary to read them. At last, when the child slept and her body sagged in exhaustion, Eli moved. He brought out another shawl, wool, heavy, smelling faintly of cedar, and laid it across her shoulders. The gesture startled her. She looked up, meeting his eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Why?" she asked, though the word came weak, hardly formed. His mouth tightened, but no sound followed. Instead, he motioned toward the hearth, where the rocking chair waited. Slowly, Clara rose and took the seat. It creaked beneath her, the sound like an old voice returning. She rocked gently, the baby pressed to her chest, her own breath finally beginning to ease. Eli returned to the doorway, standing with his silhouette against the last light of the storm-lit sky. His silence lingered, heavy yet steady, like a man who had learned that words could not mend certain breaks. Clara realized then that she had stepped into more than a house. She had entered a place where judgment lived in quiet, where survival did not wear kindness on its face but carried it hidden, like fire buried deep in coals. She did not know if she had been rescued or weighed, but either way, she and her child had been claimed, and for the first time in many nights, the thought did not fill her with fear. Tone realization. Lonely, cinematic, full of judgment and unspoken mercy, Clara realizes she has not bargained away her child. She has stumbled into a silent reckoning, and the man before her will not tell her yet if he is salvation or sentence. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, though not one Clara trusted. Morning light slanted through the narrow windows of the ranch house, catching dust motes that drifted like slow snow. She rose early out of habit, the baby still in her arms, and listened to Eli moving outside, boots in the yard, the rasp of a saw, the clink of tools against metal. It was his world she had entered. Yet the house felt crowded with ghosts. Every room bore traces of a woman long gone. In the bedroom upstairs, folded carefully within a cedar chest, lay a wedding dress. Clara had opened it by accident, searching for blankets. The fabric, though yellowed with years, still breathed faintly of lavender. She touched it only once, her fingers trembling, before shutting the lid as though she had trespassed upon a grave. In a drawer, tucked away with ribbon, she found braids, long strands of hair coiled like a relic. They startled her so deeply she let the drawer fall shut, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Afterward, she avoided that room whenever she could. The kitchen held its own silences. A rocking chair by the hearth sat too still, the wood worn smooth by use that no longer came. Each time Clara passed it, she felt eyes on her, though the chair remained empty. Eli did not speak of the woman, yet Clara saw her everywhere. She began to feel like an intruder who had stumbled into a place built not for the living, but for memory. At night, when the baby cried, she rose quickly, fearing to wake him. The child's wails echoed sharp against the wooden walls, yet more often than not, Eli appeared before she could calm the infant, bringing a kettle of water warmed by the fire, or a cloth folded with quiet precision. His steps were heavy, but his hands were careful when they set things down. It was during one such night that Eli noticed. As Clara bent to dip the cloth in warm water, her sleeve slid back. Pale scars laddered her wrist, thin lines like the marks of rope or chain. Eli's gaze lingered, though he said nothing. Clara pulled the sleeve down, shame burning her throat. She did not explain. He did not ask. Yet afterward, his eyes carried a weight when they looked at her, an understanding that unsettled more than any question. Clara's own thoughts circled her past in shadows. Once she had been a wife, a woman who kept bread rising on the hearth in a garden bright with beans. Then came hunger, drought, and a husband whose promises crumbled. He had left her one morning with a rifle slung over his back, saying he would bring supplies. She waited until the seasons changed, and still he did not return. Waiting had hollowed her until survival was her only name. Now she lived under another man's roof. And though he had not asked her to surrender herself, she feared every day what price might be waiting. Eli, too, bore his shadows. Clara saw them when he paused at the edge of the yard, his gaze lifting to the hill beyond the corral. There, marked by a wooden cross weathered by sun and storm, lay his wife. Sometimes Clara watched from the window as he stood before the grave, hat in his hand, head bowed. His stillness was longer than prayer and heavier. In the evenings he returned smelling of sweat and earth, his shirt damp at the collar. He washed at the basin, the water running gray, then sat by the fire without a word. Clara learned to read his silences as one reads the sky, some heavy with storm, others pale and clear. The baby grew louder, stronger. Its cries in the night became less desperate, more demanding. Yet with each cry, both Clara and Eli moved, drawn together by necessity. They shared sleepless hours, passing cloths, boiling water, pacing the floorboards in turns. Once, when Clara nearly collapsed from weariness, Eli lifted the infant himself, holding the child with surprising ease. He rocked slowly, the old chair groaning beneath his weight. Clara watched, heart tight. Eli's face, usually so stern, softened in the firelight as the baby quieted against his chest. He said nothing, but the sight pierced her like light through cloud. She turned away, not wanting him to see the tears that threatened. One afternoon, rain swept in sudden from the west. The sound on the roof was steady, relentless. Clara sat at the table, mending her shawl by lamplight. Eli returned early from the field, his boots muddy. He paused at the door, watching her hands move with needle and thread. She felt his gaze and froze. The silence stretched. Her scars, visible again, caught the glow of the lamp. For a moment she wanted to speak, wanted to explain, to confess the hunger, the husband's absence, the desperation that had brought her here. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she lowered her eyes and said only, "It will hold a little longer." Eli grunted softly, a sound more acknowledgement than speech, and went to hang his coat. Yet something unspoken passed between them, as though her mending of cloth mirrored his silent mending of her dignity. That night, when the baby stirred, Eli rose before she did. She heard the soft creak of the chair, the steady rhythm of rocking. Clara lay still, her eyes wet in the dark. For the first time since her husband's leaving, she allowed herself to rest while another kept watch. The house, though full of ghosts, seemed less hostile. The dress in the chest, the braids in the drawer, the cross on the hill, all reminders that loss had carved deep hollows in more lives than hers. She began to see that survival was not about erasing those shadows, but carrying them, letting them shape the silences between breaths. And in Eli's silence, she found not judgment but a recognition. Two souls marked by absence, bound by what had been taken, and slowly, by what remained. Tone, realization, introspective, haunted. Clara realizes survival means carrying shadows rather than banishing them. Eli begins to see Clara not as a beggar at his door, but as someone who knows the weight of loss as he does. The baby becomes their bridge, binding them in sleepless nights and quiet endurance. The storm came sudden, as storms often did on the prairie, rising without warning from the far horizon, rolling dark and heavy, as if the sky itself had decided to lean its whole weight upon the land. By dusk, the wind shrieked through the yard, rattling shutters and bending fence rails. Lightning split the sky in jagged veins, and thunder followed close, shaking the bones of the house. Clara pressed her child close, rocking him by the hearth. The baby wailed each time the thunder cracked, the sound swallowed quickly by rain hammering the roof like fists. She whispered against his hair, words without meaning, the rhythm more balm than sense. Eli had barred the doors, laid extra wood upon the fire, and stood now at the window, watching. His face, lit by the brief flares of lightning, looked carved from stone. Clara could see tension in his shoulders, though he said nothing. His silence itself felt like part of the storm, a steady weight against the chaos outside. Then came another sound, faint at first, almost lost beneath the storm's roar. A knocking, urgent at the door. Clara startled, clutching the baby tighter. Eli did not move at once. He waited, listening as if the very cadence of the knock might reveal the truth of the one who made it. Only after the sound came again, louder, did he cross the room. When he opened the door, wind and rain burst inside, carrying with them a figure. The man staggered forward, drenched to the bone. His face was gaunt, hollowed by hunger, eyes sharp as a hawk's beneath the dripping brim of a hat. A rifle was slung across his back, its stock worn smooth by long use. He smelled of horse sweat, rain, and long miles. "Shelter!" he barked, his voice rough with cold and desperation. "I need a roof tonight." Clara shrank back, tightening her hold on the infant. Eli's hand lingered near the doorframe, steady, unmoved by the demand. His gaze studied the man for a long moment, his clothes threadbare, his hands trembling slightly from more than cold. The silence stretched until the thunder itself seemed to answer for him. Finally, Eli stepped aside, though not far. His voice came low, calm. "Barn's dry. You'll find straw enough." The drifter's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked past Eli, landing on Clara and the child in her arms. Something in that stare made her blood go cold, though the look lasted only a second. Then he grunted, nodding once, and turned toward the barn. Eli shut the door behind him, bolting it fast. He did not explain nor offer reassurance. But when he returned to the hearth, his rifle was in his hands, and he laid it across his knees as he sat. The storm raged on. Clara could not shake the image of the stranger's eyes, nor the unease that clung like damp air. Each crack of thunder set her nerves alight, but it was the silence between those waiting gaps that felt most dangerous. Later, when the baby stirred again, Eli rose, moving toward the window that faced the barn. Lightning lit the yard, throwing into sharp relief the figure of the stranger crouched just inside the open loft, his silhouette stark against the rain. Eli's hand tightened on the rifle, though he said nothing. Clara whispered, "Will he stay out there?" Eli did not turn. "So long as the rain keeps." There was no comfort in the words, but there was certainty, and that steadied her more than softness could have. The night wore on, restless. The house creaked beneath the wind, shutters rattled, and water drummed steady against the roof. Clara dozed in fits, waking to the baby's cries, always finding Eli awake, at the window, at the hearth, or sitting motionless with the rifle in reach. His watchfulness filled the room more than speech ever could. When at last the storm's fury eased to a steady rain, Clara heard movement outside, the barn door creaking, straw shifting. She held her breath, listening. The baby whimpered, sensing her tension. Eli rose, slow but deliberate. He crossed the room without a word, opened the door just a crack, and stood framed in the gray wash of dawn's first light. The stranger was there, standing in the yard, hat dripping, rifle in his hand. His face was gaunt, but his stance held a defiance sharpened by hunger. "You've got plenty here," the man called over the patter of rain. His voice was hard, carrying accusation. "Food, fire, a roof. Seems a man down on his luck ought to be welcomed." Eli did not answer. He stood with his own rifle resting easy against his shoulder, his silence louder than thunder. The drifter's gaze slid again to Clara, who hovered behind Eli in the doorway. The baby clutched against her breast. That stare lingered too long, and Clara felt it like a hand pressing where it was not wanted. She pulled the shawl higher, shielding her child, her own breath ragged. Eli shifted then, a subtle step forward, his body a wall between her and the man. The gesture, though wordless, struck with the force of speech. The stranger spat into the mud, muttered something lost to the rain, and turned back toward the barn. His shoulders slumped as though beaten by more than weather. Eli closed the door once more, bolting it with calm hands. He said nothing, yet his nearness was answer enough. That morning the storm passed fully, leaving the prairie washed clean and bright beneath a pale sky. But inside the house the air still held the crackle of unease. Clara sat with the child, her heart unsettled. She knew now that safety was fragile, easily tested by hunger, by strangers, by the lawless space of the frontier. Yet she also knew Eli's silence was not emptiness. It was vigilance. His eyes had missed nothing. The rifle, the stare, the weight of need in the stranger's voice. Protection, she realized, had a cost. Sleepless nights, readiness without rest, silence heavy as stone. The storm had shown her what lurked beyond the fragile walls of their world. And it had shown her something else, that Eli's silence, which once felt like judgment, was in truth a shield raised not just for himself, but for her and the child who cried louder than the rain. Tone realization tense, cinematic, alive with weather and fear. Clara feels the presence of danger in the stranger's eyes. Eli proves himself not merely silent but unyielding in his watchfulness. Clara understands that safety here is not given freely. It is bought with vigilance and quiet strength. The rain did not leave quickly. It settled over the prairie in long gray sheets, steady and unrelenting, as though the sky itself meant to drown the earth. Day after day, water hammered the roof and spilled in rivulets down the windows. The yard turned to mud, the corral a mire where even the horses stood with heads hung low. The barn leaked, straw darkened, and the stranger grew restless. Eli brought him meals, bread, beans, coffee gone bitter with age, and the man took them without thanks. Soon he began drifting toward the house, knocking when the rain grew too fierce. Eli did not bar him, but his eyes stayed cold, his silence measured. Inside, the air grew heavy. The fire burned low, smoke curling into the rafters, clinging to every corner. Clara felt the weight of two men sharing a space too small for trust. The stranger's eyes lingered too long when they fell on her. At first it was only a glance, passing, casual. Then it lingered, slow and deliberate, as though he meant her to feel the weight of it. When Eli's back was turned, his gaze pressed harder, like a hand that never touched but threatened to. Clara drew the shawl higher, rocking her baby until her arms ached. The child's cries seemed sharper in those days, piercing the damp air, cutting through the silence. Each wail made her feel more exposed, as if weakness itself invited danger. The stranger began to speak more. His voice was low, mocking, the words sharp as knives meant to test the edge of silence. "Quiet man, aren't you?" he said one evening, nodding toward Eli, who sat at the table mending a bridle strap. "Never thought much of the ones who hide behind silence. Easy enough to look strong when you don't have to prove it." Eli didn't answer. His hands moved steady, threading leather with cord, pulling each stitch firm. The man chuckled, his smile cold. "Seems to me a woman and a babe are a heavy burden for one rancher. Heavy burden for a man who won't speak up, won't stake his claim. Charity don't last long out here. Ain't that right, miss?" Clara froze. The words were aimed like a dart, meant to shame, to unsettle. She rocked the child faster, eyes on the fire. Eli's head lifted at last, his gaze fixed on the stranger, not with fury, but with a stillness that was heavier. The man's smirk faltered for a moment, though he quickly masked it with a scoff. That night, Eli did not sleep. He sat in the rocker by the hearth, rifle across his knees, the fire painting his face in shifting light. Clara watched him from her place on the cot, the baby finally quiet against her chest. The sound of rain filled the silence, steady as breath. She studied Eli's profile in the firelight. His silence, once so cold and unreadable, now carried meaning. It was a shield, a wall he held firm against the stranger's barbs, against the fear gnawing in her chest. Each time his hand rested on the rifle stock steady, she felt some small measure of safety, and yet fear coiled inside her still. It whispered of her past, of helpless nights waiting for a man who never came home, of hunger that stripped away dignity piece by piece. She feared that all silence would collapse one day, that Eli's stillness could not hold against the violence of a desperate man. The house became a crucible in those days. The rain beat at the roof without pause, the fire hissed low, the stranger's eyes prowled, and the baby's cries carved through the walls. Trust and mistrust shared the same air until Clara could hardly breathe. One afternoon, when the rain eased into a mist, Eli stepped outside to tend the livestock. The stranger lingered near the table, watching Clara as she swayed with the child. "You don't belong here," he said, voice rough but edged with something sly. "Man like him, he don't talk, don't fight, don't even look at you proper. You're nothing but a mouth to feed, a mouth and a burden." Clara's heart pounded. She kept her eyes down, rocking, whispering to the baby. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You'd fare better with someone who knows the cost of survival. Someone who takes what he needs, don't sit in silence like a stone." She turned away, her breath sharp, clutching the child until it whimpered. The sound brought Eli back through the door sooner than the stranger expected. He paused, eyes moving between them, his silence deepening until it felt like judgment itself. The man leaned back, forcing a smile. "Just talking. Cabin fever, you know." Eli's gaze lingered, heavy as an anvil. Then, without a word, he moved to the hearth, set down his tools, and loaded his rifle with deliberate care. The click of metal carried louder than any threat. The stranger said nothing more that night, but Clara could not shake the dread. The walls seemed to close in, the rain pressing them all into a space too small for secrets, too small for peace. Each hour was a test, each silence a question. Would Eli's quiet strength be enough to keep the storm within their walls from breaking? Or would the house itself splinter beneath the weight of mistrust? Clara lay awake, listening to the rain, the fire's soft crackle, and Eli's steady breathing as he kept his vigil. Fear still coiled inside her, yet alongside it came a fragile realization. His silence was not indifference. It was the sound of a man carrying the burden of protection without asking for thanks. Without demanding, she recognized it. And in that silence, though it frightened her still, she found the faint outline of safety, tone realization, claustrophobic and tense. Clara sees that Eli's silence is not weakness or neglect, but vigilance. The stranger's presence threatens to fracture the fragile balance of the house, yet Eli's quiet strength holds, for now. The air inside the house had grown brittle as dry timber, every silence threatening to spark. The rain outside still drummed steady, though weaker now, as though the storm itself had grown tired. Clara moved about the kitchen with the baby at her side, humming soft to quiet him. The stranger sat at the table, boots muddy, eyes fixed upon her as though he had long since forgotten the courtesy of turning away. Eli worked near the hearth, oiling the rifle he never let out of reach. His silence filled the room like a stone wall, but Clara felt its strength falter each time the stranger's gaze pressed against her back. The moment came sudden. Clara bent to fetch a crock from the lower shelf, her shawl slipping from her shoulder. The stranger rose without warning, hand shooting out, not to strike, not yet, but to touch where no hand had right. Clara froze, heart slamming in her chest. The baby whimpered, sensing her fear. Before she could cry out, Eli moved. His body cut across the room with startling speed, faster than the years etched in his face should have allowed. The rifle lifted smooth, deliberate, like an extension of his arm. The crack of the shot shattered the silence. The bullet grazed the stranger's arm, spinning him back toward the door. His cry was swallowed by the storm as he staggered outside, clutching the wound. Rain poured down, plastering his hair to his skull, washing blood into the mud. For a heartbeat, time froze. Clara stood rigid, breath shallow, the child wailing in her arms. Eli remained by the door, rifle still raised, his face carved from fury yet held firm by control. The stranger stumbled toward the barn, then veered into the open field, swallowed quickly by the gray curtain of rain. His curses faded, leaving only the storm's weary rhythm. Inside, the silence returned heavier than before. Smoke from the rifle's muzzle drifted in the lamplight, curling like ghostly fingers. The smell of powder clung sharp to the air. Clara sank into a chair, her whole body trembling. The child's cries pierced the quiet, anchoring her in the present even as her mind reeled backward. To hunger, to helplessness, to the nights when no one had come to defend her. She shook not only from fear but from the shock of being shielded, of having a man stand before her with no demand in return. Eli lowered the rifle, checked its chamber, and laid it carefully across the table. His breath came steady, though his eyes still burned with something she could not name. He looked at her once, a brief meeting of gazes, then turned away as though words were unnecessary. But Clara saw him differently now. Not only as a widower bound to silence, not only as a rancher hardened by land and weather. She saw in him the unspoken fire of a man who chose action where speech failed, a man whose silence carried weight, not emptiness. She pressed her lips to her child's hair, rocking gently until the sobs quieted. Her own tears slid silently down her cheeks, mingling with the dampness still clinging from the storm's air. Later, when the fire burned low and the child slept, Clara found herself watching Eli as he worked by lamplight. He had drawn her shawl onto his knee, the fabric frayed from years of use. His rough hands threaded a needle, the movement clumsy but determined. Each stitch pulled the torn cloth back together, one patient line at a time. Clara sat across from him, silent. The sound of rain had softened to a faint patter on the roof, like the last murmurs of a long quarrel. She wanted to thank him, to say the words that swelled in her chest, but her throat held them fast. Finally, she managed to whisper. "You saved me." Eli did not look up. He tied the thread with careful precision, his fingers steady despite the day's violence. The firelight caught the lines of his face, the scars time had written there, the quiet strength of a man who had chosen to bear weight rather than abandon it. She tried again, voice breaking. "Thank you." His silence held, but it was not cold. It was full, heavy with meaning. The mended shawl slid across the table, placed gently before her. The stitches were uneven but strong, a shield against the cold, repaired by hands that did not know gentleness but sought it all the same. Clara touched the fabric, her fingers brushing the fresh seams. Something deep within her, long buried beneath hunger and betrayal, stirred at the sight. Gratitude, yes, but also something warmer, something dangerous, the faint pulse of trust. Eli leaned back in his chair, the rifle resting once more across his knees. His eyes, when they lifted to hers, carried no demand, no claim, only the steady weight of a man who had chosen to guard rather than take. Clara looked away, afraid of what her own gaze might confess. The fire cracked softly, sending sparks into the dark. The baby sighed in his sleep. The rain eased into silence. The moment lingered like smoke after a shot, heavy, inescapable, curling through every breath. Clara knew then that something had changed between them, as surely as the stranger had been driven into the storm. The fire between them was no longer only danger. It was also the first fragile warmth of belonging, tone realization, cathartic and intimate. Clara shakes not only from fear, but from the startling realization of being defended without demand. Eli's silence becomes clearer to her, a vessel for unspoken love and steady protection. The fire between them, once only peril, is now also connection. Morning broke pale and solemn, the storm spent, leaving the prairie washed clean yet scarred. The land steamed faintly beneath the risen sun, as though breathing after a long-held gasp. Clara stepped onto the porch with the child in her arms, the shawl Eli had mended draped over her shoulders. The air smelled of wet earth, cedar smoke, and the faint copper tang of storm-washed soil. Eli was already saddling the bay horse, his movements deliberate. He did not speak, but Clara understood. There was something yet unfinished, something owed. The stranger had not returned in the night, and the prairie did not forgive the lost. She followed him, her baby pressed close to her breast. Together, they rode out across the sodden grassland. The silence between them was not hollow but weighty, full of unspoken thought. Hooves sank into the mud, and meadowlarks sang as though to mark the day as clean, untouched by violence. It was in the canyon they found him. The stranger lay face down among rocks, slick with rain. His rifle rested a few feet away, useless now. The wound Eli had given him was not mortal, but the storm had been. Cold, water, hunger, it had all conspired to finish what desperation began. His face, turned partly to the light, no longer carried its bitter edge. Death had stripped him of menace, leaving only the plain truth of a man broken and alone. Eli dismounted without word. He knelt, checked for breath, though none remained, then gathered the body with care. Clara watched, struck by the gentleness in his weathered hands. There was no triumph, no hardness, only a quiet acceptance that even enemies deserved dignity when they were beyond defense. The burial was plain. Eli dug into the softened earth with steady resolve, sweat mingling with the damp morning air. Clara held the child and stood nearby, shawl pulled close. She remembered her own hunger, her own desperation, the way she had come begging for bread, willing to give away what she loved most. The memory cut deep, for she saw herself in the dead man, a soul pushed too far by need. Eli lowered the body into the ground, covered it with dirt, then stood in silence, hat in his hands. He did not pray aloud. He only stood as the wind passed over the canyon, carrying the sound of the earth settling. Clara bowed her head, her eyes stinging, not for the stranger alone, but for all that had been lost in the storms of their lives. When the grave was done, Eli set a simple stone at its head, unmarked, save for its upright place. Then he turned back to her. His eyes held no apology, no explanation. Yet Clara understood. Every man, no matter how far fallen, deserved to be buried as one. They rode home slow, the child sleeping against her breast. The prairie stretched wide, unchanged yet altered. The sun glanced off puddles that mirrored the sky, and each blade of grass bent heavy with dew. Clara felt the land's harshness in her bones, but she no longer feared it. It was not softer, it would never be, but it felt survivable. And survival, she now knew, was its own kind of grace. When the ranch came into view, Clara's chest ached with something like relief. The house stood square against the horizon, weathered boards silvered by years, the porch dark with rain. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a thread of promise curling into the sky. Eli dismounted, tied the horse, and lifted the child from her arms so she might step down. His hands lingered only a moment, rough, scarred, steady. Then he placed the baby back into her arms as though returning something not taken, but entrusted. The porch creaked beneath their boots. The rocking chair waited, its spindles polished smooth by years of use. Clara sat cradling the child, the shawl drawn close. The chair swayed gently, groaning with each motion, a sound as old and steady as prayer. Eli set his rifle down against the wall, leaning it where it could still be reached but no longer held. Then he took the chair opposite hers. His weight sank into it, the wood protesting softly. His hat rested on his knee, his gaze fixed not on her but on the slow dance of flame through the window. Silence settled between them. Not empty, not brittle, but alive with meaning. The hush of a house no longer haunted by strangers. The hush of survival hard won. Clara studied his face, the strong lines carved by years of weather and work. His silence no longer felt like distance. It was a language, one of presence, of watchfulness, of a love too steady to need words. Her own silence answered. She did not speak thanks. She did not promise devotion. Instead, she rocked the child and let the weight of his gaze rest upon her like a cloak. For the first time in many years, she felt not abandoned, not pitied, but seen. The baby stirred, sighed, then drifted deeper into sleep. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and bright, scarred but enduring. Inside, the fire snapped, the chairs rocked, and in that unspoken rhythm, healing took root. It was not sudden. It was not spoken. But it was real. Together, they rode into a second chance, not at forgetting the past, but at carrying it, with dignity, into what lay ahead. Tone, realization. Quiet resolution, solemn dignity. Clara realizes she has not been traded nor pitied, but restored to dignity. Eli understands that silence can carry love as deeply as words. The prairie remains harsh, but together they face it. Not as two souls abandoned, but as partners finding a second chance at life.